There is a number that most history books bury in a footnote. 2.4 million. That is the total number of Imperial Japanese Army servicemen who died during the Second World War. And when people hear that figure, they picture the thunderclap of naval artillery at Leyte Gulf. They picture the desperate banzai charges at Tarawa, the frozen summits of the Owen Stanley Mountains, the grinding urban hell of Manila. They picture men dying the way soldiers are supposed to die, in battle, facing the enemy. But here is the number that should stop you cold. Of those 2.4 million dead, over 1.4 million, more than 60%, did not die from American bullets, or bombs, or naval guns. They starved to death. They died of beriberi, dysentery, malaria, diseases that feed on the malnourished, the weak, the abandoned. They died not because the enemy was too strong, but because no one thought to feed them. They died because somewhere in Tokyo, in a room full of generals in white gloves, logistics was considered an afterthought, a pedestrian concern beneath the dignity of a warrior culture. This is not a story about battles. This is a story about what happens when a nation sends its sons to fight on the other side of the world, and then forgets to send them food. This is WW2 Battlegrounds, and today, we are talking about the supply war, the war that Japan never had a chance of winning, and never truly tried to win. To understand how a modern military power could condemn over 1 million of its own men to death by hunger, you have to understand the doctrine that drove the Imperial Japanese Army from its very foundation. The doctrine was called Seishin, spirit, not logistics, not supply chains, not caloric requirements per soldier per day of combat. Spirit. The Japanese military worldview held that the soul of the Yamato people, the Yamato Damashii, was a force that transcended physical limitation. A Japanese soldier was not simply a human being with a rifle. He was a vessel of the emperor's will, and that will could not be constrained by something as trivial as an empty stomach. This was not metaphor. It was doctrine. It was codified in the Field Service Code, the Senjinkan, which stated plainly that material inferiority was irrelevant on the battlefield. If you lost, it was not because you ran out of ammunition or calories. It was because your spirit had faltered. The practical consequence of this ideology was devastating. Mid-level officers, the men who actually understood what their soldiers were eating, what their soldiers weighed, how far they had marched, were actively afraid to request more supplies. To ask for more food was to admit weakness. To admit weakness was to fail the emperor. So they said nothing, and their men went hungry. Now layer that ideology on top of the geography of the Pacific theater, and you begin to understand the scale of the catastrophe. The Pacific Ocean covers roughly 1/3 of the planet. The islands that Japan seized in 1941 and 1942, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the atolls scattered across Micronesia, were separated by thousands of miles of open water. Some were lush with jungle, others were bare coral outcroppings with no fresh water, no soil, no fauna beyond sea birds and crabs. The Japanese expansion in those early months was tactically brilliant. They swept through British Malaya in 70 days. They took Singapore, the so-called impregnable fortress of the British Empire, in a week. They seized the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma in an offensive that stunned the world. But when the dust settled, the Imperial Army had conquered an enormous empire, and had no coherent plan for how to sustain the men they left inside it. Their answer was a doctrine called local procurement, a clean, bureaucratic phrase for a brutal reality. The soldiers would feed themselves from the land they occupied. On the Malay Peninsula, or in the rice paddies of the Philippines, this was barely workable. In the jungle highlands of New Guinea, on a volcanic island with no topsoil, or on a coral atoll 12 miles wide, it was a death sentence. The first place this doctrine revealed its full horror was in New Guinea, in the summer of 1942. Japanese commanders ordered the South Seas Detachment, elite, experienced troops, to cross the Owen Stanley mountain range and capture Port Moresby on the island's southern coast. It was a march through some of the most punishing terrain on Earth: vertical ridgelines, dense cloud forest, mud that swallowed men to the thigh, constant rain. The plan assumed the men could carry their own food over those mountains while simultaneously fighting a determined Australian defense. They were given 3 to 7 days of rations. The campaign would last months. By the time the Japanese vanguard had pushed within sight of Port Moresby, they had ceased to function as a military unit. They had become a column of starving men clinging to a trail in the jungle. Accounts from Australian soldiers described Japanese dead found with nothing in their stomachs but chewed wood shavings, bark, leaves, mud. They had walked further, climbed higher, and endured more than almost any soldiers in that war. And they had been destroyed not by Australian firepower, but by arithmetic. The human body requires calories to function. They had none. The tragedy of Kokoda is that the soldiers who suffered through it had done nothing wrong. They had followed orders. They had carried their rifles over mountain passes that mules refused to climb. They had obeyed every directive from a command structure that had fundamentally failed them. But, living off the land, carried a far darker dimension as well. When Japanese forces occupied Chinese territory, and this predates the Pacific War, going back to the campaigns in Manchuria and central China in the 1930s, the doctrine of local procurement became official policy under a directive that translates as the 3 alls: kill all, burn all, loot all. Unable to maintain a functional supply chain across China's vast interior, Japanese forces stripped occupied villages to the foundations, every grain of rice, every pig, every chicken, and then they burned the villages to deny their use to the enemy. Millions of Chinese civilians died as a direct result, not as a side effect, as a predictable, documented consequence of a military doctrine that treated the local population as a resource to be consumed. And the bitter irony is this: by devouring the local economy, Japanese forces guaranteed that within months, there would be nothing left to take. They were cannibalizing their own operational future. An army that feeds itself through destruction does not sustain itself. It simply moves forward until there is nothing left to destroy, and then it starves too. If the doctrine of local procurement was the internal failure, the United States Navy was the external executioner. Japan is, and has always been, an island nation. Every critical resource, oil, iron ore, rubber, and food, arrives by ship. The merchant fleet that carried those resources was the circulatory system of the Japanese war economy. Cut it, and the organism dies. American submarine warfare in the early years of the Pacific War was hampered by a flaw that was almost comical in its consequences: faulty torpedo fuses. American torpedoes, striking Japanese hulls at the correct angle, simply failed to detonate. For the first 2 years of the war, the most fearsome weapon in the U.S. submarine arsenal was not working properly. By 1943, that problem had been fixed. The submarines were released, and their orders were specific: do not prioritize warships. Sink the Maru, the merchant vessels. Sink the transports. Sink the tankers. Sink the food. Between 1943 and 1945, American submarines, joined by carrier aircraft and long-range bombers as the war progressed, destroyed over 8.5 million tons of Japanese shipping. That figure represents more than half of Japan's entire pre-war merchant fleet, sent to the floor of the Pacific. Picture what that meant for a Japanese garrison on a bypassed island. You have been on the island for 6 months. Your rice ration ran out 3 months ago. You are eating palm hearts, lizards, roots. You have men dying of beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin B1 deficiency, which causes the peripheral nerves to deteriorate until the body can no longer walk, can no longer breathe, can no longer function. You are watching your soldiers die of a disease that a bowl of brown rice would have prevented. And then, on the horizon, you see a ship. It rides low in the water, which means it is full. You watch it come closer. You feel, for the first time in months, something like hope. And then a column of white water erupts amidships. A Gato-class submarine, running silent at periscope depth, has just put a torpedo into the hull. The ship lists, brakes, and goes under in 20 minutes. A month of food for 10,000 men has just joined the quarrel, and the silence at the bottom of the sea. This is what Admirals Nimitz and King understood that many land commanders were slower to grasp. You do not always have to defeat an army in the field. You can simply stop feeding it and wait. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz codified this into a strategy: island hopping. Rather than attacking every fortified Japanese position, which would have been enormously costly in American lives, they selected specific islands for amphibious assault, built airfields, and used those airfields to establish air superiority over the surrounding ocean. Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands could not be reached. They could not be resupplied. They were, in the grimly efficient phrase of the time, left to wither on the vine. Some of those garrisons held out for months. Some held out for years. The men on Wake Island, the men on Mill Atoll, the men on dozens of islands whose names most people have never heard. They tried to farm in coral sand. They failed. They tried to fish from reefs swept by American aircraft. They were strafed. And in the final stages of that particular kind of isolation, documented in accounts from both Allied investigators and surviving Japanese soldiers, the social contract of the army itself broke down. On islands in New Guinea and the Philippines, in the final months of the war, there is testimony, not rumor, not accusation, but documented testimony, of cannibalism. In some cases, it was the consumption of those already dead. In other cases, it went further than that. Japanese officers issued orders explicitly forbidding the killing of fellow soldiers for food. The fact that such orders had to be written tells you everything about the conditions that produced them. This is the endpoint of a doctrine that treated logistics as weakness. This is where the road of Seishin terminates, not in glory, not in the warrior's death the soldiers had been promised, but in something almost too dark to describe. To see the doctrine of spirit over matter in its purest, most catastrophically distilled form, you have to look at Operation Yugo, the Japanese invasion of northeast India in the spring of 1944. The plan was the brainchild of Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi. Mutaguchi had been present at the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. The skirmish that effectively triggered the Second Sino-Japanese War. He was a man who believed, with absolute conviction, that will could substitute for preparation. That audacity could substitute for logistics. His plan was to drive 3 divisions, roughly 85,000 men, across the Burmese jungle and through the Naga Hills into India. The objectives were Impol and Kohima. Beyond those, in Mutaguchi's vision, lay the Ganges Plain, an Indian nationalist uprising, and the collapse of the British position in Asia. His staff officers raised the obvious concern. There were no roads capable of supporting such a force. No roads meant no supply vehicles. No supply vehicles meant no food. Mutaguchi's response, reported by multiple officers present, was to shout, "The Japanese people are vegetarians. They can find food in the jungle." He then instructed his commanders to drive thousands of oxen, goats, and cattle across the mountains as living rations. The soldiers called it the Mutaguchi Order, and in the privacy of their diaries, they called it madness. The plan collapsed almost immediately upon contact with reality. The animals died in the mountain passes. The monsoon arrived early. The paths dissolved into mud. The British and Indian forces at Kohima and Impol, contrary to every assumption in Mutaguchi's planning, did not retreat. They dug in, they held, and the Japanese assault, having carried 15 days of food for a campaign that would last months, began to consume itself. The retreat from Impol, those who survived to make the retreat, became known among Japanese soldiers as the Road of Bones. It is not a metaphor. The path back through the Burmese jungle was marked, at intervals, by the dead. Men who had walked until their legs stopped working. Men who sat down against a tree to rest and never stood up again. Men so depleted that they lacked the muscular strength to wave away the flies settling on their faces. Of the 85,000 Japanese soldiers who entered India, 53,000 became casualties. The great majority of them were not killed by the British Army. They were killed by starvation, disease, and exposure, the inevitable arithmetic of an advance with no supply. Mutaguchi was eventually relieved of command. He survived the war. He spent the rest of his life, by most accounts, unable to reconcile himself with what he had ordered. By 1945, the logistics of starvation had come home. The United States launched Operation Starvation, not a bombing campaign, but a mining campaign. B-29 super fortresses, operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, seeded Japan's harbors, coastal waters, and inland shipping lanes with thousands of acoustic and magnetic mines. Not in a single dramatic raid, but methodically, systematically, over months. The effect was a near-total blockade. Japan's imports, already devastated by submarine warfare, fell to a fraction of pre-war levels. The rice that had sustained both the civilian population and the military machine became increasingly scarce. The average daily calorie intake for a Japanese civilian fell to approximately 1,600 calories, well below the threshold for sustained physical health. The government distributed recipes for cooking sawdust into bread. Citizens were instructed to gather acorns, to eat certain grasses, to reduce their consumption to nothing and then to reduce it further. Children in Tokyo were malnourished. Factory workers producing weapons for the final defense of the home islands were too hungry to work efficiently. And still, the military hoarded what remained: fuel, rice, ammunition, all reserved for the Ketsugo, the decisive battle that would take place on the beaches when the Americans landed on Kyushu. The plan, which the Army's own logisticians knew was a fantasy, called for a final battle of annihilation. For a nation already dying of hunger, it was an abstraction built on corpses. When Allied occupation forces arrived in the autumn of 1945, they did not find a warrior race sharpening its swords for one last charge. They found people who were exhausted beyond the capacity for rage. People so hungry that when an American soldier gave a child a chocolate bar, the child did not know what it was. The Japanese soldier, the young man from Kyushu, from Osaka, from a mountain village in Nagano, had kept his end of the bargain. He had believed, he had endured, he had followed orders across jungles and coral reefs and mountain passes that should have been impassable, and the institution that had sent him there had not kept its end of the bargain in return. What does the supply war teach us? First, and most essentially, logistics is not the administrative branch of warfare. It is warfare. Napoleon understood it. Eisenhower understood it. The dictum, "An army marches on its stomach," is not a metaphor for morale. It is a biological statement of fact. The human body requires roughly 2,500 calories per day to function under combat conditions. Below that threshold, cognition degrades. Muscle mass is consumed. The immune system collapses. A starving soldier is not a brave soldier fighting through hardship. He is a dying organism unable to perform the basic mechanical functions of warfare. The Imperial Japanese Army, at the doctrinal level, chose to ignore this. Not from ignorance. Their logisticians knew the numbers. They chose to ignore it because to acknowledge the centrality of logistics was to acknowledge that Japan could not win a material war against the United States, a nation with 10 times Japan's industrial output. Seishin was not a tactical doctrine. It was a coping mechanism, a way of telling men to go and die in a manner that obscured the fact that their deaths were the product of institutional negligence rather than enemy action. Second, ideology cannot replace infrastructure. The cult of spirit was, in the end, a lie told to men who deserved the truth. The truth was that Japan could not sustain a war economy across the breadth of the Pacific. The truth was that local procurement was viable only in places with enough local resources to procure, and that most of the places Japan chose to defend had no such resources. The truth was that once American submarines found their stride in 1943, every Japanese island garrison was already in a race against death that the High Command in Tokyo had no serious plan to win. Third, and finally, the failure of Japanese military logistics was not simply a military failure. It was a moral one. To send men into a jungle with no food is an act of command, when that act is the product not of operational necessity but of ideological stubbornness, of a refusal to acknowledge that the body has needs that the spirit cannot satisfy. it becomes something closer to a crime committed by a state against its own soldiers. The story of the Imperial Japanese Army has been told many ways, as a story of fanaticism, of cruelty, of a warrior culture that chose death over surrender. All of those things are part of the truth, but beneath them is a quieter story, the story of a young man in a jungle clearing in New Guinea, or on a hillside in Burma, or on a coral island so small it has no name on most maps. He has cleaned his rifle. He has followed orders. He has believed everything he was told about duty and honor and the divine will of the emperor. And he is starving, not because the enemy was too powerful to feed him, not because the sea was too wide, not because the war had turned against Japan in ways no one could have foreseen. He is starving because the men who sent him there decided that logistics was beneath them, that spirituality was a substitute for supply, that his body was a less important instrument than his willingness to die. For every Japanese soldier who died in a documented battle, 2 more died of hunger, disease, and abandonment. 1.4 million men, a number that should not be a footnote. It should be the headline. This is WW2 Battlegrounds. I'm glad you stayed with me for this one. It's not an easy subject. If this kind of deep historical analysis is what you come here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we go where the mainstream narratives don't. Next episode, we're pulling back the curtain on Unit 731. The Japanese biological warfare program, the cover-up that followed, and the Cold War deal that allowed some of its architects to walk free in exchange for their research data. I'll leave you with one question, and I genuinely want to read your answers in the comments. If you were a Japanese field commander in 1944, and you knew your men were dying not from the enemy but from hunger, what would you have done? Ordered a final charge to end their suffering? Surrendered, knowing the shame that would follow you for life? Or something else entirely? There's no clean answer. That's exactly why I'm asking. Until next time.